Turn the recorder on. There we go. All right, we're ready to start. I'm going to share a map right away just to remind folks of what's happening. We've been focusing for the last few months on the Northern Kingdom, Israel, which at the end of last week is no more. It's gone. Israel no longer exists. But we're going to go back in time at the beginning of the split of the United Monarchy and begin talking about the Southern Kingdom of Judah. And Rehoboam was the king at the time of the split. You might recall that Rehoboam was actually up in Shem with basically the leaders of all the tribes, where they were gathering to anoint Rehoboam the new king over the United Monarchy. But the folks in the north, balked and said, nope, we're out of here. We're done with you guys. And they split off. So Jeroboam became the king of Israel and Rehoboam became the king of just the southern kingdom. King Rehoboam was the architect of a security and defense system in Judah that lasted for generations after the United Monarchy split. Like Israel, immediately after the division of the United Kingdom, Judah became aware of the change in the balance of power by Pharaoh Shishak's invasion. Amazingly, after Shishak's move, Judah still had enough resources left for King Rehoboam to begin creating an all-around defense system. You may recall from last week that Pharaoh Shishak's invasion was not aimed. It wasn't an invasion of conquest. Here comes Bob and Wendy. Hey, here they are.
Here we are.
You have to move over. No, because I can't see.
Okay, Bonnie, you're off the hook on the last one. Bob and Wendy got the last verse.
Okay.
Okay, so Pharaoh Shishak's invasion was not an invasion of conquest. It was meant just to weaken its northern neighbor, its most dangerous neighbor. Prior to the split of the United Monarchy, the Pharaoh Shishak didn't think he had the ability to do much against the entire United Kingdom, that they would just be too strong. But once they split, he saw an opening. So he decided to ravage the countryside and weaken his northern neighbor as much as possible. So this is when Rehoboam began to create his all-around defense system. So let's see, we have, Bonnie, you have the first one, 2 Chronicles 11, 5 through 10.
Yes. Rehoboam lived in Jerusalem and built up towns for defense in Judah: Bethlehem, Edom, Tekoa, Beth-sur, Soko, Adullam, Gath, Mareshah, Ziph, Adoraim, Lachish, Azekah, Zorah, Ajalon, and Hebron. These were fortified cities in Judah and Benjamin.
Quite a mouthful.
Yes, indeed.
Looking at this map here, if we go back over that list, here's Jerusalem, which is the capital. I'm zoomed in pretty well here, and the cities that were on that list were Bethlehem, Etam, and you notice it has a question mark after it because it's not 100% sure of where this ancient town was actually located. The sources that I like had it actually on this road halfway between Bethlehem and Tekoa, which I find probably more likely than this location here. Even though this one is also on a road network, it just seemed to make more sense to put it there. But either way, Etam was on the list, along with Tekoa and Beth-zur, Soko, although it's spelled differently here, Adullam, located here, Gath, Mareshah, Ziph, Adorium. Here is Lachish, Azekah, Zorah, Ajalon, and then Hebron down here. So let me switch maps. There we go. It could be said that it was precisely Shishak's invasion which made the Judeans realize the need for further sacrifice in order to prepare themselves against all future contingencies of a similar type nature. So it seems that so often in history, Shishak's terror campaign aimed at weakening the will to resist actually produced the opposite effect of a nationwide upsurge of spirit and a strengthening of the will to hold out against hostile invaders. Rehoboam's system of defense represents a concept that's diametrically opposed to that of King Solomon earlier. With the limited resources at his disposal, Rehoboam decided to concentrate on the defense of the area primarily essential for the preservation of Judah's independence. His other outstanding consideration was the use of the fortification as a means to block any hostile penetration into that area. The fortifications were to be sited so as to compel the enemy to besiege as many strongholds as possible on any potential line of approach towards the capital of Jerusalem, and to serve as bases for counterattack once the enemy had exhausted much of its resources and offensive capabilities in these long drawn-out sieges, or when, for whatever other reason, the hour for a counteroffensive just seemed proper. So when you view the fortification cities on the map, the operational concept becomes clear. Ajalon here, and Zorah, Soko, located here, Marishah, and Lachish all block one of the western approaches into the Judean mountain massif. Ajalon guards the Beth Horon ascent and the road over the Gibeonite cities. Here's the main city of Gibeon located here, to the plateau north of Jerusalem. Remember, this was the Benjamin Plateau, or the Plateau of Benjamin. Zorah guarded the Shar Haggai road. Soko guarded the Elah Valley. Marishah guarded the Marishah Hebron road. And Lachish guarded the Lachish Hebron road. All these fortresses were sited at an entrance to the mountains where the east-west roads pass from the foothills into the slopes leading up to the central watershed plateau. And in this natural division between the foothills and the slopes leading up to the central watershed plateau, the north-south avenues cut the east-west axis at the point of their entrance into the mountain territory. And all these sites are located either directly above these crossroads or close to them, which permitted easy communications and the ability to ship troops from one fortress to the other. So if you notice that Lachish is on a crossroad, Marishah, Azekah, Beth Shemesh, Eshtaol, Ajalon, they're all on major crossroads on this north-south route that cuts across all these east-west routes. All of these sites are located, well, to provide more depth to this, there was one or two other fortresses were erected on a chain of the foothills themselves. Azekah and Gath would fall into that category. Some miles inside the Valley of Elah, there's an important side road that branches off and reaches the plateau north of Hebron, and that's guarded by the fortress at Adullam. In the south, the topographical features of the terrain change considerably. The central mountain massif splits into two ridges. The western one descends in a rather moderate grade down towards the Philistine Plain and the Beersheba Valley. The effective blocking of this fan-like approaches on the lower slopes of the Western Ridge would necessitate the construction and the maintenance of about half a dozen fortresses. But Rehoboam didn't have the resources to do that. So to conserve his resources, he decided to base the defense of this sector on fortifications of a nodal point where all the fanning out ascents converged. And Adorium was therefore made the pivotal fortress of the southwestern approaches to the Judean heartland. And like Adorium in the west, Ziph lent its name to the eastern ridge, where it fulfilled the same function as a nodal point. There's a large number of tracks from the Negev desert in the south and the Dead Sea in the east that converge on Ziph. And as long as the entrances of these tracks into the Judean mountains could not be fortified permanently, Ziph then would be the point to defend. A further consideration for receding these fortresses back closer to the central mountain massif for a permanent line of defense was the scantiness of rain and water sources in the more forward areas, in the lower regions. Conditions along the eastern borders of the Judean mountains was similar to that along the southern portions. So there too, to protect from raids of the nomads, they were built to the entrances to the mountains in the upper slopes of the watershed. And that would be Tekoa and Bethlehem. The backbone for this entire defense system was the main watershed road, often referred to as the Way of the Patriarchs, along which the troops from the central reserves that were stationed in Jerusalem could easily be moved quickly on interior lines to come to the aid of any threatened sector. This vital line was guarded by the fortresses of Bethlehem and Beth Zur, located here. Each of these also straddled one or more of the ascents to the plateau. From its location alone, Hebron here was predestined to form a southern counterweight to Jerusalem. And Hebron was also chosen as a base for part of the strategic reserves, which were kept there for immediate deployment in the south. The choice of using existing towns as sites for Rehoboam's royal fortresses makes a lot of sense on many levels. Towns were usually built with an eye on natural defense, and they had control of an adequate water source, and they were connected to an existing road network. By tradition, the debris of a destroyed town was never cleared, but rather the existing wreckage was leveled out on top so that the new city was built on top of it, which means that the street levels grew higher and higher. That's why all through Israel, have any of you ever visited Israel? No, okay. A few in the other classes have. But all over Israel, there are these, they're called tells, T-E-L-L, like Tel Dan, for example. These tells are basically mounds. And I think that's what tell means in Hebrew, is a mound. And the reason it's a mound was it was a high place to begin with, but as a city would be destroyed, they'd level it, build the new city on top. And if it was destroyed, they'd level it, build the new city on top of that. So it just kept getting higher and higher. Last but not least, by turning towns into fortresses, the town dwellers themselves became automatically a permanent addition and reserve to the limited regular forces that were located in the garrisons. If we go back to the map again, we see that in spite of the substantial list of fortifications, some completely unprotected sectors appear. Most glaring is the lack of any fortification in the north, where the border was only 7.5 miles from Jerusalem, the capital. and on easily approachable terrain, that being the flat Benjamin Plateau. The reason why is political. King Rehoboam did not want to appear to be unhappy about the defection of the north by creating a permanent border with Israel. He wanted them to know that they were welcome back at any time. Of course, we know that following King Rehoboam, King Asa was faced with a different threat when the king of Israel, Baasha, decided to invade Judah and build a fortress at Ramah. We talked about this. And then Asa attacked, had this city, the fortress at Ramah, completely taken apart, stone by stone, log by log, and they used that to build new fortresses at Mizpah and Geba. So what King Rehoboam had hoped to leave open to future relationships, King Asa found it necessary to put some fortresses in there because of the actions of King Baasha of Israel. But it's a little more difficult to interpret the lack of any direct blocking in the, here it is, the Sorek Valley. The Sorek Valley, which really leads practically right up to Jerusalem. And this was a notorious axis of Philistine penetration, even as far as Jerusalem. If we apply modern military thinking, we're reminded of the principle of the killing ground and the battlefield of one's own choosing. Over the centuries, military thinkers have stated that an enemy will usually attack at a spot he thinks is to his own best advantage. If confronted with a strong belt of fortifications, the defeat of which is estimated to be extremely costly in resources and in time and in manpower, he'll try to discover a weak link or detour to effect his breakthrough. Following the common human attitude as late as World War II, planned area defenses always left considerable gaps in minefields and in obstacles precisely to entice the enemy into directing a major effort along these what they believe to be less difficult approaches. And in these sectors of presupposed enemy penetration, many measures were implemented to meet the expected attack under the best possible conditions and with the highest chances of turning it into a costly and crushing defeat. In just this manner, the Germans were beaten at Alam el Halfa in 1942 to such an extent that the conditions were created for the great British counterattack at El Alamein. It's therefore possible to see, in the lack of fortifications in the Sorek Valley, that the intentions of luring any future Shishak type into this narrow valley, which could easily have been turned into a vast killing ground for the attacker. Moving on now, the internal organization of the Rehoboamite defenses is given in Chronicles 2, chapter 11 through 12, which is
9.
I wrote it down. Jim.
Yep. He strengthened their defenses and put commanders in them with supplies of food, olive oil, and wine. He put shields and spears in all the cities and made them very strong. So Judah and Benjamin were his.
So Rehoboam's formula to ensure the loyalty and the smooth operation of his fortresses and their governors is rather amusing. His 18 wives and 60 concubines had borne him 28 sons, and from among them he chose both the commander of his army and the governors of his fortress towns. So Pat, you got the hard one. 2 Chronicles 18 to 23.
Okay.
Rehoboam married Mahalath, who was the daughter of David's son Jeremoth, and of Abihail, the daughter of Jesse's son Eliab. She bore him sons, Jeush, Shemariah, and Zasham. Then he married Maacah, daughter of Absalom, who bore him Abijah, Atah, Ziza, and Shelomith. Rehoboam loved Maacah, daughter of Absalom, more than any of his other wives and concubines. In all, he had 18 wives and 60 concubines, 28 sons and 60 daughters. Rehoboam appointed Abijah, son of Maacah, as crown prince among his brothers in order to make him king. He acted wisely, dispersing some of his sons throughout the districts of Judah and Benjamin, and to all the fortified cities. He gave them abundant provisions and took many wives for them. Goodness.
Okay, so King Rehoboam had 88 children between 78 women. So you could say he wasn't real hard on any one woman. I guess is one way to look at it. No belt of fortifications consists of main strong points alone. Advanced positions, outposts, secondary approaches, detours, and water sources all had to be guarded by forts, blockhouses, and towers that connected the main links of the defense belt. In addition to these, a network of observation posts and signal stations, mostly in the form of towers, formed a vital adjunct to the Judean fortifications. In the absence of suitable existing towns, major fortifications had to be built basically from the ground up, purely as a military site. And this was the case especially down in the Negev, sparsely populated area of the Negev, which we'll talk about next week. The Archaeological Survey of Israel has registered many of these ancient ruins, but we're not able to assign most of these ruins so far either to King Rehoboam or to any one of his successors. We do know for sure that King Rehoboam's heirs constantly added to his fortification network until the eventual fall of Judah as a nation. But the original belt of fortresses, as conceived by King Rehoboam, always remained the backbone of the national defense. The best proof of their value and function was the perseverance of Judah as an independent nation, more often than not under very strong external pressure, for 135 years after the destruction of the northern kingdom. That's a long time. To show how the Judean defenses broke actual invaders, I've chosen 3 instances that are preserved in the Bible. The first is the invasion of Judah by Zerah the Ethiopian, or a Cushite. See, Susan, you've got the next one. 2 Chronicles 14:9. You're muted, so you're muted. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Zerah the Cushite marched out against them with an army of thousands upon thousands and 300 chariots, and came as far as Marishah.
Okay, now on the map here, you see Zerah the Ethiopian. That's kind of misleading. And in the Bible, it says Zerah the Cushite. Actually, in fact, I get a subscription to Smithsonian Magazine, and this week's issue, or this month's issue, is, I don't know if you can see it, The Lost Kingdom of Cush, which was a major civilization that came out of the Sudan on the continent of Africa. And in fact, the Cush became so powerful, I mean, you can see here, thousands and thousands, they became so powerful, they actually conquered Egypt. So the Cushites actually controlled much of the northern part of the African continent. And this began the period of what they call the Black Pharaohs because of their very dark skin. So Zerah was one of the Black Pharaohs who had conquered the Egyptian pharaohs. Just a little side note. The course of the invasion is a good example of the skillful use and the exploitation of the Judean defenses. In the first phase, the aggressor was forced to break his initial offensive impetus and finally to besiege one of the blocking fortresses. In this case, it was Mareshah, located here. While Zerah was losing time and losing supplies and losing men on the siege, plus he had to screen his besieging forces against any interference from the flanking fortresses, King Asa was able to marshal his troops to the rear along the main watershed road. In the next phase, King Asa, in his own time, took the initiative by launching a counterattack, which beat his enemy in a headlong flight. Exploitation of the victory enabled Asa to destroy many of the hostile strongholds, which paved the way to the reconquest of all the lost territories in the southern plains, eventually by his son, King Jehoshaphat, when he became king. So he kind of opened the door for his son to do the rest. That was the first instance. In the second instance, in which a hostile invasion was broken by the defensive belt of Judah, is too shrouded in mystery to permit any kind of rational explanation. So we're probably not meant to know. But suffice it to say that there was an invasion of a coalition of Ammonites, Moabites, and Midianites, which included a large mass of lightly armed nomad fighters. They were stopped and caught in the meshes of the eastern defenses of King Rehoboam's fortification belt here in the Tekoa area. And this occurred towards the end of King Jehoshaphat's reign. The enemy coalition planned a surprise attack by way of the ascent of Ziz. This is the ascent of Ziz, this road here that begins down at the Dead Sea in the area of En-Gedi. And this route leads through the wilderness, past Tekoa, and joins the road of the patriarchs at Bethlehem. In fact, it's the only route, and it's not a very good one at that, which permits access to Jerusalem here from the southeast. King Jehoshaphat and basically all the people of Judah were in big trouble. And finally, they decided we need to turn to the Lord. So they turned to the Lord and begged for his intercession in this terrible time that we're facing. And the Lord's answer was very clear. Basically, he says, I got it from here. Let me handle this. So the people of Judah really didn't have to do much. But Jehoshaphat decided to put a choir in the front line. Now, all my people who are in my choir are all smiling. So King Jehoshaphat put a choir in his front line, and they sang Hodu I Adonai, which means give thanks to the Lord in Hebrew. Yay. Something caused the enemy to fall completely apart, and the coalition started to fight each other. And it completely dissolved. They turned on each other and they killed each other. So all Judah had to do was to walk in and pick up the spoils of the battle. So Bob and Wendy, have you got 2 Chronicles 20, verses 24 and 25? I think they're frozen.
Yep. Yep, we're ready. When men of Judah came to the place overlooked the desert and looked toward the vast army. We're unmuted.
Yes, go ahead.
We're not.
Try it now. Can you
Yeah.
hear us?
Yes.
Oh. When the men of Judah came to the place that overlooks the desert and looked toward the vast army, they saw only dead bodies lying on the ground. No one had escaped. So Jehoshaphat and his men went to carry off their plunder, and they found among them a great amount of equipment and clothing and also articles of value, more than they could take away. There was so much plunder that it took them 3 days to collect it.
Okay, thank you. I put a new map up while she was reading. The third instance in the Bible was in the most severe conditions. In 701 BC, King Sennacherib, the great Assyrian warrior king, invaded the Palestinian land bridge, where a coalition that was headed by King Hezekiah of Judah and the king of Ascalon, which is out here on the Mediterranean coast, those two formed a coalition, and they decided to stand up and revolt against the Assyrian domination. There are some reliefs located in Nineveh, as well as the Royal Assyrian Annals, that create a pretty vivid picture of this particular battle. Prior to the battle beginning, again, another Cushite, Ethiopian Cushite, or basically they're from Sudan, but I don't think it was called Sudan back then. Tirhakah, the king of the Cushites, had decided that it was time for him to invade the coastal plain. And at that time, this whole area was under the control of the Assyrians, not Judah. So the Assyrians fought back and defeated the Cushites here at the plain of Eltaka. So the Cushites went back home, back to their capital in Egypt. Now, after that battle, King Sennacherib decided to turn eastwards to attack Judah from the west. Simultaneously, over here on the other side of the map, a second army under Tartan, the Assyrian field marshal and royal cupbearer, advanced southward along the watershed road from the Assyrian province of Samaria to Jerusalem. Now, did you hear what I just said? This from the Assyrian province of Samaria. In other words, remember, Israel is gone. This was the capital of Israel. Now, this is an Assyrian province. In fact, Assyria had conquered and owned all of this territory. So they were advancing from their own friendly territory down across the plains towards Jerusalem. And Sennacherib's plan was to pin down the Jewish king Hezekiah with as many of the king's forces that were in town, thereby impeding his ability to direct the overall national defense effort and to neutralize all the reserves that might be employed that were now bottled up inside the city walls with the king. The Assyrian plan worked up to a point. Jerusalem was besieged, and King Hezekiah was shut up in his capital. King Sennacherib could, therefore, conduct his campaign aimed at the reduction of the strongholds and with considerable freedom, little fear of interference. By his success, the strategic utility of the Judean defense belt was severely impaired, since it was based largely on the ability of the reserves that were located in Jerusalem to come out and intervene at any given moment at any appropriate spot around the defensive belt, as they had done back during Zerah, the Cushites' campaign. But luckily for the Judeans, another quality of the Judean fortifications proved its worth, namely the exhaustive property of the fortresses, which had been strong to begin with and had been further strengthened by a succession of kings from King Rehoboam on, who were conscious of the necessity to always improve their defense. King Sennacherib's first major objective was Lachish. From the Assyrian graphic record, as well as from the archaeological evidence, we gather that in spite of Hezekiah's inability to direct the Judean defensive effort personally, the defensive campaign was waged anyway with full vigor. Lachish did fall, but at a considerable loss to the Assyrians. Yet even after Sennacherib could not unite his forces, but he had to commence another siege of another main fortification, the strong fortress here at Libnah. By that time, according to the Assyrian sources, King Sennacherib had been forced to capture 46 fortified places in Judah just to get this far. That's what I meant by the exhaustive properties of this defensive network. King Hezekiah did, however, try to placate King Sennacherib by submission and payment of heavy tribute. However, King Sennacherib felt that as long as Jewish independence was preserved in the vital land bridge, and as long as a rebellion against the rule was not punished with complete destruction of the rebel and his country, his hold over Syria and Palestine in general would not be secure. So accordingly, he doubled his efforts to the reduction of Judah, and he incurred further losses, which he was not able to make good within a short period. Now, at this moment, the Egyptian pharaoh, Tirhakah, the Cushite, saw fresh hope from the intelligence that King Sennacherib was wasting his forces in Judah. So he decided now is no better opportunity than to renew his attack and try to reclaim the coastal plain. So by falling on the Assyrian rear, because the Assyrians were concentrating on Judah. When Sennacherib became aware of this danger, he had no choice but to break off contact everywhere, beat a hasty retreat under cover of night. A modern military critic is reminded of the miracle of Verdun, where in 1916, German overconfidence led to a tremendous sacrifice of men before they retreated at a sheer exhaustion. And on a smaller scale, Napoleon's retreat from the fortress at Acre because of the Turco-British threat that was impending on his rear. I don't wish to deny, and I hope nobody gets the impression that I don't wish to deny that belief in divine aid and counsel strengthened the Judeans in their desperate fight for survival. Obviously, in the second instance, in the Tekoa area, kind of shows that. But Rehoboam's fortifications seem to play a major part in making this miracle possible. King Sennacherib's offensive power was severely curtailed. His heirs avoided becoming entangled in a war in the Judean heartland, and Judah was able to survive for yet another 115 years until it was finally conquered in 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. So if we want to sum up the factors behind Judah's survival after the division of the United Monarchy, King Rehoboam's fortifications are the main material, I'll stress, material factor. Judah was like a large porcupine that could turn its bristles in all directions whenever it was threatened. Hostile forces operating on the Palestinian land bridge tried their utmost to avoid entanglement in the Judean mountains, unless they had a very particular reason for doing so. Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser, as well as Sargon II and Esarhaddon, all kept away from the Judean mountains, which neutralized much of their very sophisticated offensive armaments while exposing them to all the dangers of one of the most wasteful types of war, that in a well-defended mountain terrain. Small wonder that whenever defenders occupied Judah in the subsequent ages, attackers from the plains always shied away from fighting in the mountains whenever possible. The great Napoleon himself expressed this attitude when he was pressed by his generals and his aides to turn eastwards after the capture of Gaza in 1799. He replied in French, which I don't speak French, but Napoleon replied, "Oh no, Jerusalem is not in my line of operations. I do not wish to be assaulted by mountaineers on difficult roads." Similarly, in 1917, General Allenby turned into the mountains only after having conquered the plains as far as Joppa, located up here, and the Yarkon River. Here's the Yarkon River Valley and beyond. Typically, once he had been able to force the Beersheba-Gaza line, it took his troops to go from that, which is way down here, the Gaza-Beersheba line, from there all the way up to the Yarkon River. He was able to cover that territory in just 12 days of fighting, okay? Once he turned eastward, and this was a distance of 53 miles. Once he turned eastward, to get to Jerusalem was a distance of only 22 miles, but it was a slow, slogging, costly action of 21 days. So he covered 50 plus miles in just 15 days, but it took 3 weeks to go the last 20. Much of this information comes from extra biblical sources, but there are many references to Assyrian attempts over 100 years plus to rule over the Judean mountains. So that's why I encourage you to read on your own 2 Kings chapter 14 through 25 and 2 Chronicles chapters 10 through 12 and chapters 29 through 32, because it's just so much information to cover. So if you haven't done that, I hope you get a chance to do it at some time so that you can see all of this in context. And as we discussed before some of you came on, we kind of figured out the pattern here. And like I said, this was a short one. That's all I have for the day. The good news is it's a short one, but the bad news is coming. But before we get to the bad news, any questions? Okay, well, I guess you're waiting for the bad news. The bad news is next week is a hard one, and it's going to be long. I'm hoping to get it to 90 minutes. I really am. But there are 2 videos about the Negev, and the 2 videos combined are 17 minutes, okay? But it's a lot of information to cover, a lot of Bible verses, not much in the way of maps. But the Monday class decided they would start 30 minutes earlier, because we usually start at 2:30 on Monday. They're going to start at 2, and I'll put all this out in an email. The Tuesday class is going to start regular time because they start early anyway. Theirs is at 1 o'clock, so 1 o'clock is still fine for them. For you folks, it's up to you. If you want to start earlier, if it's possible to start earlier, I'm available. If it doesn't work out, if it's just going to go too late for you, you know, you're always welcome to go to the Monday or Tuesday class. Also, as you know, I record these sessions. So if you can only attend for part of it and drop out, you can always go back and play the YouTube video, fast forward it up to where you left the meeting, and then you can review the rest on your own time. So there's lots of different options. I just wanted to let you know in advance, it's going to be long. So any preferences?
Well, Pat and I,
We can start early.
yeah,
We're good.
yeah, but Pat and I may try to do the Tuesday one because we'll be out of town Thursday next week.
Okay. So
Possibly
you want to,
see what else is going on, but just FYI. Okay.
that's perfectly good. You don't even need to tell me in advance. I just see your shining faces when they appear on the screen.
All right.
So for next Thursday, you want to keep the same time, or do you want to go earlier?
Let's go early.
Let's go early.
Earlier is better, I think, if it's all right with everyone.
Okay.
That's good with us.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Yes. 2 o'clock?
Yeah,
That's okay.
sure.
2 o'clock is
Will
good.
that work?
2 o'clock's good.
Wendy? They're frozen.
Go back to 1.
Monday.
Monday, I mean. Right.
Oh, okay. You're going to go back to Monday. Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, I'll put an email out with the biblical references as usual. And I'll make sure it's clear in my announcement that we're changing the times for next week. Monday will be at 2, not at 1 o'clock, Wendy. Monday will be at 2. Tuesday will be at 1. Thursday will be at 2. Do I have that right?
Warren, just to note that for the Monday people, that's Labor Day. That's a holiday.
Yes, I know. I
Okay.
know. I don't know what that means to anyone under COVID conditions, so.
Nothing.
Not a thing.
Another day,
No,
Groundhog
that's
Day.
Right.
I know.
Yeah, going
Okay, well,
Vacations.
Thank you, Warren.
let me